Throughout the entirety of The Witcher, the landscape is constantly changing. Be it from war, spectral riders plaguing villages, or political struggles leading to starving villages, or even battle-decimated towns, nothing stays the same for very long. But before I get ahead of myself, I'd like to make a few corrections and additions to my first geography and history video. For anyone who has seen my novel synopses, you know my inability to pronounce name is rivaled only by Peggy Hill. So the King of Kedwin's name is pronounced Henselt, which I discovered upon replaying through The Witcher 2 again, and the Queen of Lyria is pronounced Meve. I released the first video right before Thronebreaker came out, so I was made aware of that very quickly. Now, other corrections I have made in my novel videos already, but in case you haven't seen them or you are just interested in the world-building stage of your Witcher journey, I'll make them again. Geralt's title of Rivia was an idea given to him by Vesemir. He told Geralt it would be wise, so he just chose Rivia. It was simple irony that the Queen of Lyria and Rivia would one day knight Geralt of Rivia. These events transpire in Baptisms of Fire, as well as Thronebreaker. And if you want more details on them, like I mentioned, my novel synopsis goes into detail about them. Now from here, I'm going to transition to the events that end the Second Great War. More specifically, the Battle of Brenna and the Peace of Sintra Treaty. Starting from the perspective of a young man named Shar. These events take place during the events of the Lady of the Lake, so spoilers ahead if you plan on reading it. During Ciri's time at the Temple of Melitele in Elander, she met a young boy named Shar. He spent much of his time in the temple, reading and learning everything that he could. Ciri had a few occasions in which she needed his studious brain, and he would happily offer his services. After a short while, like so many others, he would become rather sweet on her. He even worked up the courage to try to kiss her once, but unfortunately for him, it left him with the embarrassment of rejection. Once Ciri had left with Yennefer, and all the events had occurred up to the events of the Lady of the Lake, tales of her had reached all over the land, including the temple. He had decided he didn't wish to simply sit at the temple while the woman that he had become so infatuated with was in danger. So he did the one thing he felt would help. He joined the fight against the tyrannical Nilfgaard. His journey to be conscripted would land him at the front lines at the Battle of Brenna, in an infantry unit you may have heard of. Possibly one of the most minute references in The Witcher 3 may be this, a somewhat useless Northern Realms Gwent card that references his company. His journey would also come with a price, but he is merely the first character in a spiderweb of events that would one day be taught at universities and become known as the Battle of Brenna. Next we met Julia Abitamarco, who uses the alias Pretty Kitty, and was colonel of the North's Free Company of Mercenaries. She and her company were gathering intel for the upcoming battle, such as the present divisions of Nilfgaard's army, including their elven allies of the Vryad Brigade. Though the Free Company was not in the position to lead the North's army, they scouted the landscape and gathered that Nilfgaard was sending their horse cavalry to the front of their lines so they could properly prepare for it. The Northern Kingdom's army consisted of the Redanian Royal Corps, with 8,000 strong horse and foot soldiers on the left flank, the center consisting of 12,000 Temerian and Redanian infantrymen, protected by 10 companies, plus a reserve of 3,000 troops from Maribor and Vizima. On the right flank, Barclay Els, the dwarf, led 8 companies of light horse, as well as the Free Company mercenaries and companies of the Mahakam dwarves. And on a hill overseeing the field, King Foltest and Constable John Natalis commanded all. Nearly 2 miles away, Field Marshal Mino Corhun commanded the endless black tide of Nilfgaard. consisting of nearly 46,000 men. While preparing to begin his assault, he had wished to wait, as his scouting team was performing reconnaissance. There was a hill in the middle of the battlefield that obstructed their vision, and he wanted no surprises to unfold. However, from the perspective of his reconnaissance team, we see that be it fear or just sheer laziness, the hill would not be scouted, and Field Marshal Menno Corhoon would signal his officers to rally their men, with the confidence that it was clear. The chaos of war often ensures that everything that it touches will be equally chaotic, be it a blacksmith overworking to prepare swords and armor, a mother raising a family on her own when she loses her husband, or, in this case, a tent of field medics preparing for a hellish day of blood, fatigue, and screaming. One halfling, by the name of Milo Vanderbeck, or Rusty as he went by, was preparing himself for the day, for he knew it was going to be arduous. Luckily for him, however, he wouldn't be doing it alone. He would be joined by the mage, Marty Sodergren, the priestess from the Temple of Melitele, Iola, and a medically trained student from the University in Oxenford, Shawnee. The three women were strangers to him, so he did his best to prepare them for what they were about to face, but he knew that nothing he could say would truly ever prepare them for what was about to happen. It was time. Nilfgaard's Alba horse cavalry spearheaded into the center of the North's army. Few words were wasted describing the bloodshed. Men killed men, fathers killed sons, sons killed husbands, and we get an occasional look into the minds of both Nilfgaardian and the North soldiers, wondering how they ended up there and what they were doing, and what all the death and chaos was really for. Back at the medical tent, Rusty and his new band of volunteers had their hands full. The halfling triaged patients as they came in, deciding who could be saved and who could not. Marty used her magic, and Iola and Shawnee bounced around like headless chickens. The screams of the injured and dying, drowning out all of their abilities to think, Rusty took opportunities to teach where he could. And to dive into the deep end like this, there were many. Some of the men were worried about who was winning, while others begged for death, unable to deal with the pain that they were in. Outside, the battle raged on. The left wing of the North's army crashed into the black-clad army. From their raised vantage point, the Northern army's leaders noticed something worrisome. Their dwarven company on the right wing was in danger of being surrounded. So John Atalis sent a messenger to warn them. This, however, was no easy feat. The young 17-year-old Cornet Aubrey would have to ride through a hellish landscape of death, bloodlust, and fear. He was nearly cut down at one point, but he had a guardian angel. Where Nilfgaard was pushing through, the free mercenaries pushed back with all of their might. Pretty Kitty found Cornet and helped fight off his offenders, before frantically helping the lad reach Barclay Ells with Natalis' warning. Once they arrived, Cornet feared he was too late, as Nilfgaard had reached them, but Ells assured him he was not too late, but the Black Cloaks had arrived too early. The orders from Constable Natalis to fall back had little effect on the headstrong dwarf's will to hold back the Blackclads. He instead gave the order to summon Yarpen Zigrin and Dennis Cranmer from the front lines. That day, the dwarves of Mahakam, as well as the free mercenaries, would fight like the Spartans at Thermopylae, surrounded, but still killing tenfold of the numbers that they had. Field Marshal Corhun clenched his fist. He realized the Ard-Fane division was being bested, so he sent in reinforcements, in the form of Isengrim and his elven allies. The intensity of the medical tent had not slowed. The four were still battling death and infection faster than they could move. Until a patient came through and demanded Rusty's full attention. The men who brought him before Rusty told him that he was a master with a sword. Rusty pulled back his eyelids, and they were cat-like, and he had somehow survived the journey to the medical tent with a pierced heart. A witcher, Rusty gathered, and thanks to his brothers in arms, he also knew his name. Cohen, one of the witchers who was at Kaer Morhen during Ciri's time there. However, there was nothing Rusty or anyone else could do about his wounds, putting an end to an already rare breed of witcher. But now is not the time to grieve. Several men came in, rushing with a wounded man at their side. They demanded he be seen now, as he was Daniel Echeverry, a count, but Rusty would not give him any special treatment, and he'd have to wait his turn, just like everybody else. But once his turn came, his leg would need to be amputated. The next to enter the tent would not be an injured soldier, however an equally panicked one. He warned the medics to flee, as Nilfgaard had broken through. The four ignored his warnings and carried on with their work. He repeated himself and scurried away, afraid for his life. The rabble and noise outside the tent completely dissipated, but faint footsteps could still be heard. 4 elves entered the tent and said nothing for a moment before one of them spoke, saying he felt a conflict of interest was in place, as why bother wounding men if others were just going to heal them? And he began killing the wounded defenseless men on their cots. Shawnee began to scream in terror, while Iola threw herself over another wounded man. The elves heartlessly threw aside Rusty and Iola before they noticed something that freezes them. The man that the medics were protecting was a Nilfgaardian soldier. The elf known as Yavin was shocked. His silence was brief before one of his comrades called him back, and the elves left without saying another word, leaving Rusty with a craving for hooch. Behind the scenes of the battle, the hill that worried Field Marshal Corhun so much was about to come into play. For from behind it, the Redanian cavalry was about to erupt into the Nilfgaardian army. The thunder of hooves against the plain shook the ground. The North's infantry cheered as their relief had come, in the form of Redanian horse cavalry. They clashed into the Black Sea, shouting for the death of the Black Cloaks, a crippling blow to their army, as well as a blow to Corhun's composure. He was livid that his reconnaissance officer had detrimentally failed. But he hadn't become field marshal by allowing a fluke to cripple his plans. He and his advisors quickly adapted their plan. They theorized that they can send the Elven Brigade in, follow them in, and strike their rear lines to ensure panic. They wasted no more time, and they put their plan into motion. Zhar's Vizima pikeman infantry unit had spent much of their day, in Voivode Bronibor's words, been stuffed with dust and sniffing horse farts. But their time had come to prove their worth. The Nilfgaardian army was going to attempt a flank on them, using horse cavalry, and his unit was to snuff out that flank. A task he could tell his unit was very nervous about. Even those amongst him that he knew to be professional soldiers seemed shaken, which left the task of stirring up his men to Bronibor, but he was having little success. He assured them the black clads were counting on them to drop their pikes and run, but if that were to happen, they would be trampled and killed regardless. He roared at them to close ranks and stand ready. The ground began to shake. The cavalry was close. We don't get much of the riveting details regarding the actual skirmish itself, but on the left flank, the Nordling army, the brave Azeman infantry would stop the wave of Nilfgaard, marking a severe tipping point in the battle. The failure to break the north would cause the blackclads to fear and understand the day was lost. Menno Corhun understood that as well. His advisors brought him a horse and instructed him to flee. He had no desire to do so, but they eventually convinced him. His retreat, however, was no straight shot. Though the battle was lost, the fighting had still not ceased, and he and his officers would have to go through much of it. First, they had to hack their way through a row of light volunteer horse. Though not unscathed, all titles and formality had gone by the wayside, and survival was all that mattered. But eventually they did make it out. An open field was now the only thing standing between an escape. But then he heard a sound. Arrow fletchlings hissing through the air in their direction. But this would not be his only concern. Their horses, who were at full gallop, were suddenly waist-deep in marsh, sending their riders face-first into the bog. The sounds of arrows cracking through armor, horses neighing, and men screaming filled the plain, but Corhun was alive. Barely. He and his officers were soon in the company of others. Zoltan and his company of Arbalest stood over the dying Nilfgaardians. They pettily asked for mercy. But even if the Nordlings could understand them, no such mercy would be shown. Using what little knowledge of the North's language, Corhun tried to identify himself, but in vain. Before his life was ended by 3 more arrows, one to his chest, to his hip, and to his clavicle. Back at the still chaotic hospital tent, Iola had stepped out for a brief moment when she saw a familiar face. She called out to Shar. He looked at her, and Iola saw an emptiness in his eyes. The kind one might see in any soldier's eyes, one might say. She took notice of his damaged hand and brought him into the medical tent. Rusty was working on Bronabor, who was also critically injured. Iola told Rusty that Shar was a friend of hers and he had been injured, but Rusty reminded her that no personal feelings should allow those less injured to be prioritized. But almost as if on cue, Shar passed out and collapsed into the dirt. Rusty paused and instructed the women to put the unconscious soldier on the table. Upon investigation of his arm, Rusty suspected the only thing keeping his hand in place was his sleeve, and instructed Shawnee to get his saw. His arm would have to be amputated above his elbow. This marked the beginning of the end for Nilfgaard in the Great War. Many who were present would go on to live long lives. Shar would grow old and write memoirs of this day. He would start his own family, including a daughter that he would name Ciri, after the woman who had swooned him at such a young age, and be responsible for his time in the military. Shawnee would live an additional 72 years and make appearances in the original game as well as The Witcher 3. Julia Pretty Kitty Abetamarco would grow old to tell stories to young ones about her and her free mercenaries who destroyed 2 divisions of Nilfgaard's army, but many others were not so lucky. Marty Sodergren would die 2 weeks after the battle for an affair with a Free Company officer. He stabbed her once he learned of a Temerian officer that she had also been seeing. Rusty and Iola would die a year later in Maribor of a disease that would go down in history as the Red Death. The two chose to remain in the city to help the sick when all others had fled. It would cost them their lives, but it was a sacrifice that they were willing to make. Now, the political fallout of the Battle of Brenna is another big topic that entails a treaty known as the Peace of Sintra, as well as set in motion the events that will give us King Radovid the Stern, Dijkstra's personal rebellion from the north, and a bit of other things. So that will be the next video. And following that will be the synopsis for the Season of Storms. As always, feel free to ask any questions or add anything important you feel should be added. And thanks for watching.